Imagine a freezing train car hurtling through the night toward Georgia. It is November 1910. Inside, traveling under aliases, sit the most powerful bankers on the planet. It was there, on Jekyll Island, in an atmosphere of total secrecy, that a plan was born, a plan that would change the global economy forever. On December 23, 1913, Congress passed that plan, and the Federal Reserve was born, a behemoth independent of both the president and the will of the people. In actual history, that day marked the end of financial freedom as the Founding Fathers understood it. But what if the echo of Jekyll Island has returned a century later? Only now, instead of cigar smoke and whiskey, we have server racks in the cold glow of computer monitors. Fast forward to November 2025. The world is on the brink of a new financial revolution, but its true puppet masters remain in the shadows. In our reality, in January 2025, President Donald Trump signs a historic executive order. He appoints David Sachs as crypto czar and sets a course for establishing a strategic crypto reserve. A victory for digital anarchy, it seems. Senator Cynthia Lummis proposes a bold plan: purchase 200,000 bitcoins annually to pay off the national debt by 2045. The market is rallying, expecting Bitcoin to stand shoulder to shoulder with gold. But in our alternative scenario, on December 18th, Fed Chair Jerome Powell issues a stern statement: no Bitcoin on the government's balance sheet. It looks like a conflict, a war between the White House and the money printer. However, let's look back at the 1951 Treasury-Fed Accord. Back then, the Fed asserted its independence from the Treasury Department. And in 2012, that independence transforms into absolute power. While the masses are fixated on flashy headlines about the crypto capital of the world, something strange is happening in November 2025. The Fed suddenly pumps a record $29.4 billion liquidity into the system through repo operations. The official line for the press: technical stabilization of interbank rates. Analysts offer reassurances. It's not quantitative easing, just some grease for the gears. But use your imagination. What if those billions aren't just grease? What if this is a smokescreen for Operation Digital Jekyll? In our story, that money didn't just sit in the banks. It became the capital for a clandestine buyout of digital assets through a network of intermediaries that were already the subject of vague rumors back in 2021. Imagine the Federal Reserve, while publicly dismissing Trump's crypto reserve, is secretly building its own. Not to help the government pay down the national debt, but to seize total control over the one asset designed as a hedge against them in the first place. Over $29 billion isn't a market bailout. It's a hostile takeover of the very idea of decentralization. We are on the verge of a chilling revelation. The era of crypto's wild growth didn't end in a crash. It ended with a change of ownership. And while investors celebrate the green candles on their charts driven by an influx of liquidity, they have no clue they just sold their freedom to the very Leviathan they swore to destroy. Welcome to the new digital 1913. Imagine a building with a foundation poured over centuries. It seems unshakable. But what if I told you that in 2020, this colossus was rocked not by an earthquake, but by a single signature? To understand the scale of this catastrophe, or perhaps the greatest scam of the century, we need to rewind the tape. 1791. The first Bank of the United States is established. It was the government's first timid attempt to rein in the financial beast. Nearly a century later, in 1863, the National Banking Act tightened the noose by introducing federal regulations. But the real game began shrouded in secrecy. December 23, 1913. While the country was preparing for Christmas, a group of bankers and politicians on Jekyll Island pulled off an operation that birthed the Federal Reserve. Textbooks tell us it was an act of stabilization. But Republicans at the time cried out in warning. They saw the birth of a monster beyond the control of both the president and Congress. And now we come to the sacred cow of modern economics, 1951 and the Treasury-Fed Accord. This was the document that officially sent the Treasury and the Fed to opposite corners of the ring, granting the Federal Reserve its legendary independence. In our reality, this agreement was considered an unshakable dogma. Jerome Powell, the current Fed chair, repeated like a mantra on December 18th that Bitcoin would never become part of the National Reserve. He was defending the old world. But in our alternative timeline, January 2025 was the month the Treasury-Fed Accord turned into toilet paper. President Trump signs the executive order strengthening U.S. leadership in digital finance. David Sachs enters the scene, appointed as the crypto czar. This isn't just a title, it's a battering ram aimed at the Fed's gates. While Powell publicly denies any ties to crypto, a coup is taking place behind closed doors. Sachs issues an ultimatum. Either the Fed adapts or it gets left on the sidelines of history. In early March 2025, Trump announces the creation of a strategic crypto reserve. The list includes not just Bitcoin, but also Ethereum, Solana, XRP, and ADA. The market is disappointed by the lack of immediate purchases, dismissing it as a PR stunt. How naive. They missed the big picture. Remember the 2021 rumors about the Fed secretly owning Bitcoin through intermediaries? In our scenario, that was just a warm-up. Back in 2024, Senator Cynthia Lummis proposed buying 200,000 Bitcoins annually to accumulate 1 million coins by 2045. Former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers called it insanity. But in November 25, insanity became the strategy. Watch the hands. It's November 2025. The Fed suddenly pumps a record $29.4 billion in liquidity into the system through the standing repo facility. The official story is stabilizing the banking system. But in our alternate history, that money didn't go to the banks. It was a covert buyout of digital assets under the guise of a market bailout. The Truman Accord is effectively dead. Fed independence has become a fiction. The governor of Texas has already established a state-level crypto reserve, setting an example for the feds. The old fiat model, held together by nothing but promises and treasuries, has begun its teardown. David Sachs and the Trump administration didn't just legalize crypto, they forced the printing press to bankroll its accumulation. The almighty dollar, the symbol of power since 1791, has begun its transformation into a digital ghost, governed no longer by the bankers of Jekyll Island, but by code and a new political will. December 18, Washington, D.C. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell takes the podium. The entire financial world stands still. Journalists are waiting for a bombshell, as Senator Cynthia Lummis has just introduced her high-profile Bitcoin Act. Her plan sounded like a challenge to the entire establishment, requiring the Fed to buy 200,000 Bitcoins annually for 5 years to build a reserve of 1 million coins and pay off the staggering U.S. national debt by 2045. But Powell was stone cold. Into the microphone came a firm no. He publicly rejected the very idea of including cryptocurrency in national reserves. The market exhaled, concluding that the traditionalists had won. But what if that no was the most expensive lie in financial history? Let's imagine that Powell's public refusal was nothing more than a brilliant smokescreen. In our alternative reality, while former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers was appearing on every news channel calling the idea of a crypto reserve insane in a way to pander to Trump campaign donors, a secret task force was already at work in the basement of the Eccles building. They remembered the lessons of history. In 1913, the Fed was created following a clandestine meeting of bankers on Jekyll Island, far from the prying eyes of Congress. More than a century later, history was repeating itself. But this time, the stakes weren't gold, but digital code. The scenario unfolded rapidly. In January 2025, Donald Trump signs an executive order on strengthening U.S. leadership in digital finance. David Sachs is appointed crypto czar. Officially, the White House speaks only of regulation, but behind the scenes, a completely different game is being played. The governor of Texas, tired of waiting for the feds, signs a bill to establish the state's own gold and Bitcoin reserves. For the Federal Reserve, this was a code red alarm. If states begin accumulating decentralized assets before the central bank does, the monopoly on the printing press will crumble. Recall the 21 rumors that the Fed was already using intermediaries to handle crypto. In our version, these sleeper agents were activated at this very moment. The climax arrives in November 2025. Official news reports share a dry detail. The Fed is injecting a record $29.4 billion in liquidity into the system through repo facilities, the highest amount since the pandemic. Economists describe it as stabilizing the banking system. But in our alternate timeline, those billions didn't go to the banks. This was the cash for the final buyout. While the public was busy grumbling over Trump's March announcement that there would be no active buying, the Fed was using a complex network of proxy funds to vacuum the market, snatching up every available Satoshi. They weren't fighting Bitcoin, they were nationalizing it without even notifying the president, relying on the independence they've held since 1951. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the conclusion of this financial drama, because next we'll reveal how this secret maneuver redrew the map of the world. November 2025. A cold rain fell on the streets of New York while euphoria unfolded on traders' screens across the globe. Bitcoin was storming new all-time highs. The crowd cheered, seeing the long-awaited to-the-moon moment, but none of them noticed the news slowly but surely tightening around the neck of decentralization. In our reality, this month was marked by the Federal Reserve injecting a record $29.4 billion into the markets through the Standing Repo Facility, or SRF. The official story was that this was aid for banks to stabilize interest rates. But in our alternative version, these billions became a smokescreen for the execution of Secret Protocol 1913-25. The Fed wasn't saving the banks. The Fed was buying control. Let's rewind to March 2025. Remember Donald Trump's executive order and the high-profile appointment of David Sachs as crypto czar? In reality, Trump announced the creation of a reserve, listing assets like Ethereum, Solana, Ripple, and Cardano, but without any plans for active buying, a move that left speculators disappointed. In our story, however, this motley list of altcoins was a brilliant smokescreen. While everyone was debating the legitimacy of meme coins and the utility of Ether, deep within the treasury, in the kind of silence big money craves, Operation Golden Bitcoin was being forged. In a twist of fate, Senator Cynthia Lummis's 2024 bill, which proposed purchasing 1 million Bitcoins to pay down the national debt, wasn't rejected as many believed. It was rewritten and classified as top secret. What happened next is eerily reminiscent of events from a century ago. On December 23, 1913, following a secret meeting of bankers on Jekyll Island, the Federal Reserve was created, a private entity that gained control over the nation's money. 112 years later, history has repeated itself, but now the target of the takeover isn't the dollar, it's digital gold. The $29 billion plus injected in November through repo deals didn't go toward bonds. Through a complex network of intermediaries and the forced nationalization of liquidity pools at major American exchanges, the Fed effectively bought up a critical mass of the Bitcoin in circulation. The 21 rumors that the Federal Reserve indirectly owned crypto turned out to be child's play compared to the reality. On December 18th, Fed Chair Jerome Powell addressed the press. In our reality, he opposed including Bitcoin in the reserves. But here, on this bleak winter day, his words sounded like a death sentence for the free economy. Powell announced that from now on, Bitcoin was not just an asset, but a new gold standard backing the digital dollar. And most importantly, that the keys to 90% of North America's mining capacity were being transferred to the control of the Federal Open Market Committee. The governor of Texas, who had attempted to create an independent state crypto reserve, was forced to surrender all assets to the federal government under the threat of being charged with financial separatism. The blockchain didn't stop, far from it. Transactions moved faster than ever. But now, every single one passed through a filter of government-approved validators. Decentralization died to the thunderous applause of investors who had become wealthy but were no longer free. Operation Golden Bitcoin concluded in a total triumph for the central bankers. Here is what was actually behind the headline, "The End of the Era of Growth." Most traders, staring at the red candles, took it literally. The end of price gains, a crash, a total wipeout. What a massive mistake. In our alternative reality, that headline meant something else entirely. It wasn't the end of rising prices. It was the end of the era of free, wild, uncontrolled growth. The end of the romance. Think back to history. December 23, 1913. While America was preparing for Christmas, a group of bankers meeting in secret on Jekyll Island pushed through the Federal Reserve Act. Thus the Fed was born, an institution meant to stabilize the chaos. But back then, many Republicans warned that it was a noose around the neck of the economy. 112 years later, History has repeated itself with chilling precision. Only now, instead of Jekyll Island, it was a secure server in Washington, and instead of paper dollars, it was cryptographic code. In our scenario, the events of November 2025 were the turning point. In reality, the Fed simply injected $29.4 billion in liquidity into the system through repo operations to destabilize the banks. But in our version of history, that money didn't go toward bailing out the banks. This was the money printer being cranked to full power to buy up Bitcoin from the panicking masses. Back in 2021, rumors were already swirling that the Federal Reserve was testing the waters of digital assets through shelf funds. In November 25, they stopped testing, they started absorbing. In reality, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers called the idea of a national Bitcoin reserve crazy, a way to pander to donors. In our story, however, his words became the epitaph for the old financial system. It's madness, he said, but the system had already made its choice. When the governor of Texas signed the bill creating a state crypto reserve, the federal government realized that if it didn't lead the movement, it would tear the country apart. The establishment could not allow the states to be wealthier than Washington. And here we are, Bitcoin, which was created as a weapon against the Fed, an alternative to the printing press and inflation, has been swallowed by the very monster it was meant to kill. Sure, the price will go up. It'll skyrocket to millions per coin. But this is no longer the money of free people. It's a new gold standard. Only the gold is digital now, sitting in government multi-sig wallets. The 1951 Treasury Fed Accord on central bank independence has been de facto shredded. Now the Fed and the White House are a single fist tightening a digital noose. The era of expanding freedom is over. The era of total control has begun.